Thank you, Mira, for the introduction. It's very exciting to speak with Professor Phil Lieberman today. And congratulations on your new translation of the Guide to the Perplexed. I'm very excited to see it. I believe it comes out next year. So it's very interesting to hear your perspective on this great work and on Maimonides. Your previous research is focused on the social, economic, and legal history of the Jewish community, mostly in Arab and Muslim lands. So if you could please begin by introducing yourself and talking about your niche in scholarship as a social historian and how this current project fits into your wider scholarly work and career.
Thanks so much, Eliyahu, for that opportunity and for the opportunity to present to My Jewish Learning today. So I am, as you say, an economic and social and legal historian. I have a bachelor's and master's degree in economics, and before I started doing Jewish studies, actually was an options trader on the floor of the American Stock Exchange and the New York Futures Exchange. And so, when it comes to, someone like Maimonides, who was involved in various long distance trading pursuits, I feel very connected to that. But I did a master's degree in Talmud and Rabbinics at the Jewish Theological Seminary. And then the last piece of my graduate work was in the Department of Near Eastern Studies at Princeton, where I wrote my dissertation about Jews and Muslims and economic life. And that dissertation morphed and grew into the book that you have on the screen there, The Business of Identity, from 2014. What I tried to do in that book was sort of bring all the pieces together. Both Jewish law and Islamic law and the documents of the Cairo Geniza, which are really the sort of richest trove of materials from the medieval Islamic world, bar none, right? Because there are something like, let's say, 500,000 fragments. Some of those fragments are really tiny, some of them are very substantial, but we don't have anything like that from Muslim hands. And so one of the things that scholars since the late 19th, early 20th century have been doing is trying to figure out how we can use the documents of the Geniza, most of which came from the hands of Jews, to say something about their non-Jewish neighbors. Typically their Muslim neighbors. And this, to my mind, is actually like the big question in the field of Jewish studies as a whole. How is it that the Jewish community connects to the broader community of which it is, a sort of a component, right? So when I teach classes at Vanderbilt, I typically, like the first or second class, I talk about, the sources that I use, and then I walk over to the garbage can and I say, let's look in this garbage can and see what students at Vanderbilt are eating and drinking and where they're shopping and so on. And what does that tell us about Vanderbilt students? But then what does that tell us about American life in general? And when I did this at a talk in Denmark, right, I went to the garbage can, it was all beer cans, right? Because obviously it was Denmark. So, the relationship of the Jewish community to the broader world, that is, to my mind, the central question in Jewish studies. And that's one of the things that I ask in The Business of Identity. We have documents from the Geniza about business relationships. And one of the leaders, really the founders of the field of social history of the Jews of the medieval Islamic world, Shlomo Dov Goitein, began to, argue that the Geniza is really a kind of a window, not exactly a window, more like a kind of a mosaic into the medieval Islamic world as a whole. And Goitein relied very heavily on letters, because content in letters is really exciting. It gives us all kinds of detail about what someone's daily life is like. When we talk about Maimonides, we'll also talk about, his letters and what that tells us about what his life was like. But I, in this 2014 book, looked at legal documents and tried to say, where do these legal documents sit vis-a-vis Jewish law on the one hand and Islamic law on the other hand? And, as someone who lives in America in the 21st century, right? My house is on the market. If and when I sell my house, that agreement isn't going to look like Jewish law. It's going to look like American law, right? So if we think about, that American law piece, the broader culture as the Islamic law piece in the medieval Islamic world, right? Goitein and one of his colleagues, students, Avram Yudovich, argued, hey, the documents in the Geniza really look like Islamic law, like the broad marketplace. But I really pushed back on that. In this book, I identified ways in which the Jewish community did things in a kind of distinctively Jewish way. So anyway, that's what that book was about. In my 2022 book, The Fate of the Jews in the Early Islamic Near East, also was about questions of how the Jews fit into the medieval Islamic world. But this project, the translation of the guide, started a little bit over a decade ago. I came to Vanderbilt 14 years ago, and my colleague Len Goodman, who I hope everyone on the call today will come and hear at the next iteration of this series. Len sat me down and said, "Hey, I'm thinking about translating the guide again. Would you like to work with me on this project?" Now, Professor Goodman is a philosopher to the core, right? Knows medieval Jewish and Islamic philosophy, incredibly well. But not only that, but also the Greek antecedents to all of that. And you'll see that in our translation, in the notes and so on. And what I brought to this project was the social, economic, and legal history background, right, that kind of fills in from the philosophical, because the guide is a work of philosophy, but it also engages the Bible, as we'll see in a little bit, and that engagement sometimes involves questions of law, the questions of Jewish law, questions of Islamic law, and Maimonides will use terms because he writes the guide as he writes almost everything that he writes, right, with the exception of the Mishneh Torah, his legal code, which he calls his great work, his magnum opus, if you will, right? He writes that in Hebrew. Everything else, right, he writes in Judeo-Arabic, Arabic written in Hebrew characters. And he'll use terms in the Judeo-Arabic that are terms that I knew from Islamic law, right? But they have a distinctly Jewish flavor to them, I would argue. So when you translate a work like this, you can't just be an Arabist, right? You have to be a Judeo-Arabist. You have to understand the context in which Maimonides is writing. The other thing that's going on, I think, when one translates a work like this, and in this, Professor Goodman was incredibly helpful. I think when you translate something, you have to know what direction the author is going, maybe even in broad strokes, what the author is trying to communicate before you translate it, right? You can't just sit down with something, because words have such a broad range of meaning, and this is particularly the case with Arabic, right? Where there are famous Arabists known for saying that every word in Arabic means a thing, and then it means its opposite, and then it means something having to do with the camel, and then it means something totally offensive also. So words have this broad range of meaning, and if you don't know what direction the writer is going, right, you can kind of latch on to the wrong thing. And Eliyahu, when we talk about series of translation of the guide in specific, Professor Goodman kind of initiated me into understanding that there are distinct schools of translation, and we talked about how it is we might like to go forth with this project and how that would be different from other translations. And a lot of that basically amounts to the range of meaning that any single word can have. Right. There are various theories of translation of the Bible or other Jewish works. Right. You might know about Martin Buber and Franz Rosenzweig's translation of the Hebrew Bible, right, where they tried to rely on certain what they call Leitwörter, or kind of leading words, and they translate those leading words into the German the same way each time. Right. The problem with that is, once again, right, there are ranges of meaning of any word, and sometimes nailing yourself down, right, can trap you. And so when we translate here, we really try to translate so that the reader can understand Maimonides' arguments. And so, when you ask how I came to this project, number one, it was through Professor Goodman, but it was also out of a desire to move beyond the economic and social and legal history and get to know the philosophical a little bit. So for me, this was a tremendous process of growth, just getting to know what Maimonides is arguing, what he's doing in the guide.
Thank you. So you talked about the Geniza. We have on the slide here an example of a handwritten responsa of Maimonides. More than any other medieval Jew, if I'm not mistaken, we have more material in Maimonides' own hand and other material relevant to his life. And so we have the fullest biography of his life, more than any other medieval Jew. So I'd like you to speak about how the Geniza helps fill in this biography and what holes does it still leave?
Listen, as you say, Eliyahu, right, the Geniza is really useful for filling in that, the daily life, not just in Maimonides, but of a whole bunch of, other well-known figures. But because the Geniza was discovered in Fustat, in Old Cairo, right? And that is where, for at least some of his life, Maimonides lives. We also think that he's got a place in New Cairo, and he kind of jockeys back and forth between the two. Because he is there in the late 12th and early 13th century, right? And because he is writing into the kind of legal elite and of his community, we have actual letters of his. We have legal documents that he signed off on. We have here, as you say, right, a response. And someone asked him a legal question, and he's got the answer. And in fact, it's possible through these responses sometimes to track a history. I've got an article in Jewish Quarterly Review, I think from early 2020, where I look at two of these responsa, and I come to the conclusion that Maimonides is writing two different responsa on the same case, because litigant number one came to him, and then a year or two later, litigant number two, the other side, came to him and asked him, what should the ruling be? And he writes subtly different rulings for each side of the case, which that opens the door to us using the Geniza to ask about the genre of legal responsa, right? We think about responsa perhaps as, the scholar writing from the ivory tower about what the law should be. But really, the Geniza, by opening up these responsa to us, right, is giving us a window into the nitty-gritty of daily life. The person who approached Maimonides is someone who Maimonides might have known, maybe had coffee with, right? Maybe did business with that person. And so did that affect what the legal ruling was, right? So that's, those questions I started to kind of weigh in on. As for Maimonides' life, right? Yeah, the Geniza is tremendously valuable because we get letters, copies of letters and so on that actually tell what he did all day. As for questions about his life, there are of course a couple of controversial matters that the Geniza itself probably won't resolve, partly because some of them happen elsewhere. Right before Maimonides moves to Egypt, he spent some time in Morocco, and I hope we'll talk a little bit about that. And the question of whether Maimonides, during his time in Morocco, actually was a crypto-Muslim, someone who on the outside, right, seemed to, in order to escape persecution, practiced Islam, but really retained his Jewish identity internally, or he didn't do that, right? So that's one controversial matter. Various historians have weighed in on both sides of this. But to my mind, right, as an economic historian, one of the most interesting and as yet unresolved questions is about Maimonides' professional life, right? Maimonides comes to Cairo, to Old Cairo, Fustat, and he serves as a communal leader. But then his brother David, right, is involved in the 12th century long distance trade going down the Red Sea and towards India. And on his second voyage, we believe, David Maimonides goes down in his ship and dies, right? And this puts Moses, right, puts our Maimonides, in bed, seemingly like depressed for a year. He doesn't get out of bed, and so on. And then he becomes a doctor, right? Now, what explains this shift from being an investor in his brother's business and a community leader to taking on the extra responsibilities of becoming a doctor, right? And supporting his family that way. To my mind, right, Maimonides could have invested in multiple ventures, right? Some involving his brother and some involving other people, and therefore reduced his risk if his brother went down in a ship, which eventually he did, right? He could have hedged his risk by, doing something that many of us do today with our, with our wealth, which is diversify, right? And it would have cost him nothing to diversify. And yet it seems that he didn't. So I'm not sure that the explanation that Maimonides goes to, work because the family was, was driven to, some kind of level of poverty because his brother, David, who was the breadwinner, right, goes down in the ship. I'm not sure that that flies. And I think that we might come to a greater understanding of why it is that Maimonides made that shift when he did, and perhaps why his family didn't invest in multiple shipping ventures, but had all of their eggs in the basket with his brother David. So that's just one example of some of the remaining kind of problems that we have in Maimonides' life.
Very interesting. You write in your introduction to the new edition of the guide that Maimonides saw himself throughout his life as an Andalusian and then identified himself by signing his name in Hebrew as Moshe ben Maimun Hasfaradi, the Spaniard, or Al-Andalusi, the Andalusian.
Yeah.
What is most important to know about this Spanish or Andalusian background?
All right, so first the thing about names, right? So names are very complicated in the medieval Islamic world, right? So we call him Moses Maimonides, or in Hebrew, Rambam, or perhaps Ha-Rambam, whatever. But, he was also known in Arabic as Musa ibn Maimun, fine, Moshe bin Maimun, but also he had a nickname, Abu Imran. And that nickname is very common for the name Abu Imran, which is akin to like Abu Amram in Hebrew, right? The father of Moses in the Bible, right? Just as someone with the name Daoud might be Abu Sulaiman, something like that. So there's a kind of, so there's a common nickname for someone with a certain personal name. So too, he's also got the name Hasfardi or Al-Andalusi, which indicates the place where someone is from. And also sometimes individuals have names that indicate their profession. So in my 2022 book, The Fate of the Jews, I use this naming information, names like Hasfardi or Al-Andalusi, to say something about where people living in Egypt are from. Because if you're called the Spaniard, right, that means you are somewhere outside of Spain. I live in Nashville, Tennessee right now. It makes no sense to call me the Nashvillian because everyone here is the Nashvillian. Instead, I would say, oh, I'm from, fill in the blank. I was born in LA, or I lived in New York for 15 years, right? And so those place names like Hasfardi or Al-Andalusi, those suggest that you came somewhere from somewhere else. Now, those monikers don't last forever, right? That is to say, as I said, I was born in LA. I don't really think of myself as being from LA. I've lived in Nashville for 14 years after being in New York for 15 years. So maybe I would say, oh, I'm sort of from New York in a way. When I move on in a few weeks to Washington, D.C., I will be someone from Nashville, even though that's not where I'm really from. It's just where I've sojourned for a while. So those names, those geographic names can tell us something about migrations. They can't tell us everything because those location names will move, they'll change over time. Also, they don't necessarily mean that someone lived there. In Maimonides' case, they do, but sometimes someone will get a name, because, you visit or you have serious business with some other location, and therefore you get the name as being tied to one or another place. In Maimonides' case, though, the name Al-Andalusi or Asfardi, I think, speaks to more than just where he is from. I think it has a cultural valence. right? And I think the idea here is that there is a love of philosophy, of science, of medicine, of learning that is in his blood, in his culture in Spain, that isn't quite there when he gets to Egypt. I think that when he gets to Egypt and the people that he interacts with, at least the people whose records we have in the Geniza, right, many of them are involved in, as I said before, long distance trade and other forms of business, right? That is seen by Maimonides, perhaps, I'm going out on a limb here, as being kind of unduly pragmatic and practical and focused on making money and not necessarily focused on the life of the mind. Whereas I think when he calls himself Asfardi or Al-Andalusi, that he is hearkening back to the idea of living in a golden age of Spain where there are, shared Muslim, Jewish, Christian dialogues in the philosophical domain, in the medical domain, and in poetry and so on. And so this is kind of a badge of honor for him as being from Spain. And he retains it throughout his life when he is in Egypt in this, community that is an important trading hub, right? But it doesn't have the same kind of valence as places like Lucena in Spain, not far from Cordoba, or even Cordoba itself, or Granada, which were centers of Jewish learning and centers of the sciences and centers of philosophy, as well as El Belet, higher culture, poetry, song, and so on. So that's what I think is going on when Maimonides calls himself the Spaniard.
Thank you. For our next question, you discussed the controversy around Maimonides' conversion. Without getting into all the details, the scholarly debate, I think it's very interesting that one of Maimonides' most famous works, other than the guide, is Epistle on Forced Conversion.
Correct.
And we have this very famous letter that is interesting to read in light of his biography. So I'm hoping you can briefly explain what is this letter of the Epistle on Forced Conversion, and maybe if there are other instances in which knowledge of his life as revealed in the Geniza, or knowledge about the economic life of Jews, helps make sense of other parts of the guide to the Perplexed that perhaps were more obscure in the past.
Thank you, Eliyahu, for that. Let me take a step back and think more broadly about what conversion means and what the dynamics of conversion might have looked like in the medieval Islamic world. Because in my 2022 book, The Fate of the Jews, I talk about conversion of Jews to Islam as really affecting the demographics of the Jewish population in the medieval Islamic world. Okay. Now, in order for us to get into this, we have to actually shift from the West, where Maimonides is born, right, Spain, and Morocco, where he moves, right, all the way to the east, to Iraq, not exactly as the cradle of Islam, but certainly as an area of Islamic kind of foundations, because it was an area that was conquered very early on as the Islamic polity kind of developed. And it also becomes very early on a center politically and also kind of religiously for Islam. Now, in the 2022 book, I argue that as Islam came on the rise, right, in the middle of the 7th century, right, something like 90% of world Jewry is living in Iraq. Now, that's hard for us because we think about all these other population centers of Jews in the medieval Islamic world, right? So not just Iraq, but also the land of Israel and Egypt, the home of the Geniza, and also Spain and Morocco. Really, scholars think 90% of world Jewry is living in Iraq at the time of the rise of Islam. And so in that 2022 book, I talk about how we get from this place where 90% of the world's Jews are living in Iraq to the High Middle Ages, where that center of Jewish demography has shifted farther to the West. Okay, so we have to somehow have that Jewish community in Iraq, which is really the spiritual center, right? Not necessarily the land of Israel, but Iraq, because of the academies where the Babylonian Talmud was composed, right? And the academies continue, through the 12th century. They're, still writing, and there still is some kind of presence at those academies, right? And they're writing to folks throughout the entire Mediterranean diaspora, right? As far west as Spain. So we saw responsive of Maimonides, that was him writing in Egypt for someone living locally. But we know that folks from the Talmudic academies in Iraq are still writing and sending letters and response all the way west, even almost up to the time of Maimonides himself. So those academies were kind of a spiritual center, okay, and also a demographic center, we believe. So what explains this kind of atrophy of that Jewish population in Iraq? Now, I argue, as Islam came on the rise, right, in the middle of the 7th century, right, being a Muslim didn't mean the same thing that it might mean in Maimonides' time or later, that it was something distinct from, inimical to perhaps, being Jewish, right? Now, if you look at, let's say, the Pew Study of Jewish Americans, right, you'll see that there's a certain stratum of the American Jewish population that on Saturday morning goes to synagogue and on Sunday morning goes to church, right? These people think there is, I guess, nothing inimical to being Jewish and Christian simultaneously. Let's take a step back from that, right? Even people who might think that you can't be a Jew and a Christian simultaneously don't say that you can't be a Jew and an American simultaneously. And yet, many of the aspects of American life, like having sacred time, right? Like Memorial Day, right? You go and have a barbecue. Labor Day, right? You take off work. Thanksgiving, right? These are kind of American religion. You have American religious times, right? You have American religious foods, perhaps even dress and sacred items that describe a religion. Now, again, you can be simultaneously an American and a Jew. Now, so in the book, I argue that as Islam came on the rise, being a Muslim was not really that distinctive, or rather not inimical to being a Jew. And so there were people who, for various reasons, straddled the fence between Judaism and Islam in the early days. Okay, now, over time, obviously, there's more of a wedge. And what I argue in the book is that those folks that straddle the fence have to decide what side they're on. And so they go over to the Muslim side. But I bring all of this up to point out that even if Maimonides did convert, right, this doesn't mean that he's eating camel, right? What it means is that, externally, perhaps, he might have gone to the mosque on Fridays, right? Well, so what exactly does that mean? Is he praying in public? Is there anything that is inimical to Judaism in doing that? It's a good question. And, even if he did something that might on the surface seem as though he's a Muslim and not a Jew, right? One thing that, he argues is that it's okay to, if you have to, because there is pressure from above, right, from your overlords, right, look like a Muslim in public and be the Jew in private. That can be okay because of that governmental pressure that's coming from above. So, now we can get into this whole question of, is there forced conversion going on in the West in Maimonides' time? Scholars believe that, it's pretty well known that shortly after Maimonides himself is born in 1138, the city of Cordoba is taken over by a new regime, folks called the Almohads. The Almohads come up from North Africa, right? So they are part of a kind of their second wave of Berbers coming from North Africa into Spain. And they're also seen by many as trying to let's say implement a religious crusade of sorts in Spain. Their name Almohad means perhaps the easiest way of translating would almost be monotheists or Unitarians, because the word wahad or ahad in Hebrew is in there, right? So there are people who are focused on the one God. Of course, being a Jew is inimical to to that, because we say the Shema, we believe in only one God. And so, scholars had thought that perhaps the Almohads really put a lot of pressure on Jews and certainly Christians to convert, leading many to leave areas such as Cordoba. And Maimonides himself ends up leaving Cordoba and then eventually ending up in Morocco, which is the heartland of the Almohad domain. So it's very interesting that he goes from the frying pan into the fire, from a place that had been taken over by the Almohads into the center of the Almohads in Morocco. Recent scholarship has kind of revealed that the Almohads actually were not necessarily persecuting Jews and Christians as much as earlier generations of scholars had believed. Number one, there are Jewish doctors who are serving Almohad leaders. Number two, the Almohads themselves married some of the leaders, married some of their children off to Christian rulers living in the north of Spain. Now, part of that is just political, but if you are really interested in crusading, why are you marrying off your kids to their leaders? So there's been a kind of a softening of the early historiography of the Almohads. So Maimonides, for reasons that we can't explain, seems to go from the frying pan into the fire, and perhaps under that pressure to convert there, really does spend some amount of time externally practicing Islam. But as I said at the beginning, it's not clear that anything that he does is actually inimical to Jewish life, which is why, some folks say, well, he really didn't convert, and others say, well, no, he did convert, but still maintained this Jewish identity.
Thank you very much. So we wanted to talk about the guide itself and your new translation, and I asked you for a chapter that illustrates some of your methodology and your interests, and you chose 3.41. So maybe you could talk about the structure of the guide, what it means, chapter 3, and what chapter 41 is about in the third part, and we could learn this text for about 10 minutes.
That sounds great. So, the guide itself, Maimonides writes in his kind of introductory letter, he says to his addressee, Joseph in Judah, I'm going to write this in sections and send it to you. And so, just like any book that we produce over a long time, if we produce it serially, it's not necessarily at the end the same thing that it was at the beginning, and the different parts of the guide do different things. Right. So I think nonetheless that there is a real connection between those parts. It is a whole. And that whole, to my mind, is an attempt to square the Bible with some basic philosophical premises. So, for instance, part 1 of the guide, there's a substantial section of it that's involved in dealing with language. And one of the philosophical premises that Maimonides wants to deal with is, does God have a physical form? And his answer to that is no. But wait a minute. If we look at the Bible, it says, oh, this is the finger of God, or God saw. Well, if God saw, God must have an eye. Right. And then in each of those chapters, there's a kind of a clear structure. Maimonides says, the word to see means you have an eye. But if we think about other forms of the word to see, it means to understand. Oh, I see where you're going with this. Right. So that chapter starts out with the physical and shows that the word also has not a metaphorical, but an intellectual component to it. Right. And so he's not necessarily reading the Bible so much metaphorically is saying you can understand the imagery of the Bible in this way. So this allows us to square difficult words in the Bible with those philosophical premises. I think in part 3 of the guide, he is doing something similar with respect to the law. So if in part 1, he's rationalizing the language, in part 2, he's rationalizing the kind of cosmology, how the world is put together as the Bible and sometimes as the rabbis understand it. And then part 3, he's talking about the law in the Bible. And that's what this section is about. So he goes through and breaks all of the laws of the Bible into 14 different categories. By the way, right, his major legal work, right, the Mishneh Torah, also is broken into 14 categories. And he goes through in each of those sections and says, how is it that this law makes sense? How is it we can understand the law in light of what the Torah's ultimate goals are? And so here he is looking at capital punishment. right? Someone who commits, in general, he starts out by saying the penal laws make up the sixth group. So the general benefit is well known, right? We know why the penal laws exist, right? It's to create order and so on, and it is to, recompense someone who suffers harm and so forth, right? Now, what's really interesting to my mind about this section, this is why Eliyahu chose it, is Maimonides knows that there is the biblical law, right, of the biblical penal law, and then there's rabbinic penal law, right? And the rabbis take the Bible and they rework it into a totally different system of punishment that is, I might say, at odds to the simple meaning, how we might simply understand the biblical text itself. But that is the rabbinic lens, right? Just as, for instance, where it says an eye for an eye, right? The early rabbinic literature is, an eye for an eye. That means monetary compensation. Well, would I say that if I were just reading the Bible without the rabbinic lens? Probably not, right? But Maimonides doesn't look through the rabbinic lens in this chapter, right? Instead, he's trying to explain the Bible on its own terms and explain that in light of philosophy. And that's really important because that's what he's trying to do in part one as well. Now, that doesn't mean that Maimonides doesn't cite rabbinic literature. It doesn't mean that he is not aware of the rabbinic lens. He cites rabbinic literature like 1,500 times in the guide, right? But in this chapter, and I dare say, like throughout part three, where he's talking about the biblical law, right? Yes, sometimes he makes recourse to the rabbinic lens, but here he's really talking about, really mired in biblical law and trying to explain biblical law in order to rationalize and explain how biblical law of crime and punishment here, right, is designed to create an ideal society.
Thank you very much. So we're at the 20-minute, or almost at 20 minutes left. Let's just ask the question of the final period of his life. This is a Geniza document that shows corrections of the guide and its handwriting. If you could talk about how the last years of his life are relevant to our understanding of him. If I'm not mistaken, he finished his last published work a significant period before his death, with no new works in the final period, if I'm not mistaken.
But as you see here, Eliyahu, right, when the guide is finished, and the guide is, we believe, because he says at the beginning, sent off in sections, right? But even before he completes it, and before he dies, right, he sends it out for translation, right? And so he sees, so number one, right, we see that he's revising the work. And number two, he sends it out for translation, and Samuel ibn Tibbon, right, who lives in Provence, right, but also of Spanish roots, right, goes ahead and translates the guide, and Maimonides sees the translation, and he says, listen, you did what Buber and Rosenzweig did in their translation of the Hebrew Bible. You tried to translate my words the same all the time. You take an Arabic word, you translate the same Hebrew word all the time. I would have preferred that you translate for the argument, for more of the flow, and not necessarily be mired in the words themselves. This is important because Ibn Tibbon's translation into Hebrew has to make up a lot of words that aren't really in common use in Hebrew. Why? Because the philosophical vocabulary that Maimonides uses is in Arabic. The philosophical discussion is in Arabic, right? Now, it is through, right, the early Greek works that get translated into Syriac, so another kind of dialect of one of these Semitic languages like Aramaic and Hebrew and so on, and then into Arabic, and then eventually into Hebrew, that those works will get translated into Latin and make their way into Christian Europe. But the philosophical discussion of Maimonides' time is really going on in the Islamic world, and it's taking place in Arabic. So when Ibn Tibbon translates, he's got to make up words sometimes, and Maimonides is not happy with Ibn Tibbon's translation, that it is sometimes mired in the words, and he provides corrections to that too. So it's not that Maimonides is retired, right? It's that the activity has changed a little bit, and he is, in this case, as we see, editing his own work, but he also makes comments on Ibn Timon's translation. Ibn Timon, seems not to accept the recommendations, right? As someone who ends up getting his work edited a lot, I know, I don't always accept the editor's recommendations, but I do try to keep an open mind. Ibn Timon, had his own system, and as I say in my introductory material to the translation of the guide when it comes out, I hope people buy it and read it. This sort of gives rise to different strains of translation, and Ibn Timon's school certainly is one way that people have continued to translate the guide in its 800 plus year history since then.
Thank you. So let's move to the round of questions and answers. So if we could open up the chat again. And David Goldstein asked, how does Maimonides, the guide to the Perplexed, address the use of gematria or numerology? And is there any significance to 14 that I'm adding to that? You mentioned the 14 comes up both in the guide and in the Mishnah Torah.
Yeah. So, all right. So first, I don't remember gematria appearing in the guide itself, but obviously Maimonides is aware of it because we call the Mishnah Torah, the Yad HaChazakah, Yud Dalet is 14, right? And it's in 14 parts. So in there is a kind of a structure to the guide itself, as I've said, but I don't think that the number of chapters, let's say, corresponds to any gematria. And I don't remember seeing gematria itself being addressed in the text of the guide. So I don't have a kind of fulfilling answer, because we know that gematria is very ancient practice, right? Because we see it in early rabbinic literature, right? It is one of the ways that the rabbis read the Bible, because they see one word encoded in another word that has the same numerical value. Maimonides, I think, is not functioning at that level when he is reading the Bible. I think he is functioning with his lens, out a little bit more, a 10,000 foot view and a 30,000 foot view, instead of gematria, which is really looking at the word itself and saying, well, okay, so, what is the numerical value of this word? And therefore this figure is really that figure, because their names have the same numerical value. So I don't think that it really shapes Maimonides' reading of the Bible.
Thank you. We have a question. The question says, the Penis translation of Professor Shlomo Penis has been the standard academic text for over 70 years, along with its two introductions. Why a new translation?
Yeah, so as I said, Penis is following a practice that is not unlike Ibn Timon's. If you know Arabic, right, and you have the Judeo-Arabic text of the guide in front of you, and you have Penis's English translation in front of you, because English is your mama lashon, right, it is very easy to go from his English translation back to the Judeo-Arabic, right? Because every word that he translates, not every word, but corresponds to, particularly the Leitwörter, to the words that are there in the Judeo-Arabic. So Penis is a very useful resource for Judeo-Arabists who are doing a very close reading of one or another term. Penis's translation, I submit, is not as helpful for someone who wants to understand the broad arguments that Maimonides is making. And that is, I submit, deliberate. And I think you can get this if you read Leo Strauss's introduction to the Penis translation, in which Strauss argues that Maimonides is writing on two separate levels, right? The simple level for the simple Jew, and the esoteric level for the philosopher. And sometimes those conflict with each other, right? And Leo Strauss, best known for his work Persecution and the Art of Writing, argues that where someone is under pressure and can't say what he or she wants to say overtly, says it covertly, esoterically. And therefore, the book doesn't have to make sense on its surface. Penis, because he is not necessarily translating for the argument, right, but he's translating for the words, can sometimes get nailed down, and it can be difficult to read him, because that's okay with Penis, because he's not translating for the argument, because he believes that the argument is something that is hidden underneath and esoteric, and one who might know it will know it, but he is translating for the words, for the surface meaning. Okay. Now, Professor Goodman and I took a different approach. We see the guide as esoteric, but we see it esoteric in a different way. If you imagine a spiral, right? When you start learning the guide, you're on the outside of the spiral. As you continue learning it, you work your way to the inner circle. Now, what Penis imagines is concentric circles that don't touch, right? But what we imagine is a spiral that one can work one's way to the center. And we would argue that not only do the Greeks do this, that's their view of esotericism, but it's also an eminently Jewish view that we read the Bible over and over again, right? Where Isaac gives the blessing to Jacob instead of Esau, and then Esau shows up, right? We know before he breaks down crying the high drama of the passage because we've read it already. Okay, and so we believe that the guide should make sense. Penis is, willing to at times have passages that are very difficult to read in his translation because he believes that people will read it on different levels, and those levels are like concentric circles rather than like a spiral. I hope I've explained that well.
Thank you. There was a question about the acceptance of Jews by Muslims outside of the Almohad realm. I'm wondering, though, to expand it, as a economic and social historian, what your study of economic history reveals around this issue of discrimination between Jews living in a Muslim land.
Yeah, so in my dissertation research and my 2014 book, I deliberately looked at arrangements between Jews and other Jews because I wanted to see if when Jews were doing business amongst themselves, they were adhering to Jewish law, or if they were adhering to some kind of law of the broader marketplace. Right. Nonetheless, there is evidence that Jews and Muslims did business together. Right. One, perhaps, is the famous responsum of Maimonides himself, in which he says, a Jew and a Muslim are in a business together. Right. And the Jew wants to take the profit from Friday, and the Muslim wants to take the profit from Saturday, and then they could have their arrangement. Now, one question that one needs to ask then is, to what extent is this responsum descriptive of the broader marketplace, right? And that's a very, very difficult question, right? The Geniza samples material, again, largely from Jewish hands, but the mercantile letters are from merchants. What part of the economy are the merchants from? Perhaps the kind of middle class and better, right? How is it we get at what ordinary people are doing? How is it we get at what people from the top end of the spectrum are doing? That can be very difficult. So any time that we try to ask questions about kind of acceptance, right, or what daily life was like, it is very difficult to make generalizations because Jewish life in Spain before the Almohads even was very different from Jewish life in Iraq or Jewish life in Egypt. In fact, part of why we have the Geniza documents that we have is because the synagogue in Old Cairo and Fustat was destroyed in the late 10th, early 11th century because of one particular Islamic leader who really had it in for Jews and Christians living in Egypt. Now, if that was an exception, which we believe it was, then we might say the rule was for much more acceptance, much more integration in economic life. For instance, we know that there wasn't in Cairo kind of a Jewish ghetto, if you will, but instead there was much more residential integration. Okay, that doesn't mean there isn't an area of kind of relatively dense Jewish population, but in homes, right, which might have been built around a courtyard, and there might be many apartments, right, that some of those would be occupied by Jews and some would be occupied by Muslims. It wasn't as though there was an area that was just Jews because Jews were not allowed to be residentially integrated. Now, so what does that say about the broader Islamic world over hundreds and hundreds of years? Very difficult to say. right? I would say that, probably you shouldn't make generalizations, but we can say that there are moments when life was, was good. We can say that there are moments when life was difficult. And I think that pointing those out is very important.
Thank you. There's a question regarding Maimonides' attitude towards Jewish chosenness or Jews being innately superior. This argument is associated with Professor Menachem Kellner, Haifa University, in contrast to Judah Halevi. So, of course, you could give several lectures on this topic, but if you could sum up your view on the matter.
I mean, listen, Maimonides writes in the guide that, you can be open to wisdom coming from above, right? You can prepare yourself to be a prophet by studying the sciences and studying theology and so on, being open to that revelation that comes from above, but still not get there, not be a prophet like Moses, right? So some of that, right, comes from on high. All that you can do is kind of lay out the conditions for it. And so I would say that, does Maimonides believe that the Jews are the chosen people? Certainly that's the rhetoric, but he also, understands that, there are, the Jews are living in a cultural context in which they are very integrated. Did he have a kind of sense of esprit de corps and specialness, distinctiveness? For sure. But, I think it is different from, what Judah Halevi, which might be a little bit more focused on the specialness, if you will.
Okay. There's a question about the language of Maimonides' works. If you could address, in his time, he was aware of this Hebrew translation, right? And we know that he wrote his magnum opus, the Mishnah Torah, in Hebrew. So I guess that makes us wonder, why did the philosophical work, the guide, why was it written in Judeo-Arabic as opposed to Hebrew?
So number one, I'd say the vocabulary is there. But number two, I'd say, again, he writes everything in Judeo-Arabic except for the Mishnah Torah. Right now, I'll tell you, my own take on why it is that the Mishneh Torah is written in Hebrew in 1 second. But even when he's dealing with rabbinic literature, his commentary on the Mishnah is written in Judeo-Arabic. His personal letters are written in Judeo-Arabic. Now, that is because, right, Judeo-Arabic is the language of daily parlance, right? It is the language that people use when they go to the marketplace. It is the language that they use when they engage much of the time in their legal business, right? Now, what is Hebrew used for? Hebrew is the language of the Torah. So when Rambam writes the Mishnah Torah, I argue that he writes the Mishnah Torah in Hebrew because, as he says in the introduction there, I've written the Mishnah Torah so you can have on your shelf the Torah and the Mishnah Torah. I argue that Hebrew has a kind of a sacred valence to it, so that by writing the Mishnah Torah in Hebrew, it has a kind of Torahitic, let's say, grandiloquent valence, almost sacred, right? Such that it can sit right next to the Torah on your shelf. Whereas, right, the guide, which is a philosophical work, right, this is seen as, almost more quotidian. Even though, philosophy is, the queen of the sciences, if you will, right? Nonetheless, right, what's going on here is he is writing in the language of, of daily parlance, also writing in a language that, if read aloud, his Muslim interlocutors would understand. And so this is the language that, his community speaks and writes in. Again, he writes the Mishnah Torah in Hebrew. All of his works, many of his works get translated into Hebrew very, very quickly. He's not concerned that if by writing something in Judeo-Arabic, he's not going to reach a broad audience, because his works do get translated very quickly into Hebrew. I think, therefore, because it's not about communication, the reason he writes the Mishnah Torah in Hebrew is because he wants it to have this kind of sacred role as a book of the law next to that other book of the law, the Torah.
Thank you. So I'll put two questions together. The first is from Jasper, and he said, Jasper writes, what if Rambam, Maimonides, was reincarnated today? And then I'll add this to the question by Deborah, which is did Maimonides deal with the question of people saying you're not Jewish enough? And what is the best response to this accusation today? And so if Maimonides was reincarnated today, what would he say about this criticism of this tension within the community of being Jewish enough?
I mean, if he were reincarnated today, I mean, what shul would he go to? That's, difficult to say. He'd go to the Rambam shul. I don't know. Would he be surprised at the direction that Judaism has taken? Perhaps. What does it mean to be Jewish enough or not Jewish enough? Right? This is a question I submit that's a modern question in the following way. Right? The modern folks have a choice of how Jewish they might be. Whereas for Maimonides, being Jewish is not just a kind of religion, if you will, but it is his community. Right? It's where he goes for legal matters. It's where he goes for food. It's where he goes for spiritual insight. That doesn't mean that it's not shaped by the Islamic context, but I don't think anybody is saying, well, you're not Jewish enough, or, you are too Muslim. As I said, with respect to Jews living in Iraq with the rise of Islam, right? It's only where there's kind of a, radical wedge that people have to kind of choose one or the other. But as in the modern period, right, as an American, we can decide, I want to be more Jewish, right? What might that look like? Well, I might have more identifying markers, right? Or I might observe in a particular way that is more Jewish, right? That kind of continuum, I don't think is something that he is thinking about. So that would be a real shocker for him.
The final question is, what will Professor Lieberman be doing in Washington, D.C.? Is this a new academic appointment or a short-term stay? And I'll let you end on this. And thank you so much for your time today. And congratulations on the new accomplishment. Mazel tov and mabruk.
Thank you so much. Thanks again for this opportunity. So in a couple weeks, I'm moving to the Washington, D.C. area to go and serve the United States Naval Academy in their Department of History. So I, in addition to being a faculty member at Vanderbilt, I serve the United States Navy as a chaplain, and in that role, I'm eligible to be called up to active duty service to go teach at the Naval Academy. So I won't be serving as a chaplain. I will be a professor, again, in the Department of History, teaching in the summer and the fall, pre-modern Mediterranean and Western history. So actually all this work with Maimonides, because it's a shift west from what a lot of my core work has been in Iraq and points east, this is an opportunity for me to allow my work as a Mediterraneanist and as someone who thinks about, life in the Mediterranean, particularly long distance shipping, which is something that, as I said, Maimonides' brother David is involved in. I can communicate that to future naval leaders. So looking forward to that for the next 3 years. So thanks so much.
Thank you both so much. And the recording will be sent out later. Thank you so much, Phil. And thank you so much, Eliyahu. This was great. And we look forward to seeing you all next week to speak with Phil's colleague.
Yeah, please do. That will be, an amazing opportunity to learn still more about the philosophical underpinnings of the guide.